Hey everyone, welcome to our program this morning or afternoon for those of you on other parts of the world with Dr. Marc Brettler. I'm Matthew Silverman, the Executive Director of the Haberman Institute for Jewish Studies. I'm not sure if many of you are quite ready yet, but Passover is only about 2 weeks away now, and we all hope to have lively, deep, and meaningful conversations, even if it's over Zoom again this year, as we're all sitting here on Zoom right now. So unfortunately, I imagine that'll be the case for most of us or many of us. So this time together this morning will offer us our opportunity to reflect upon the Seder and the Haggadah and see how it developed from the rabbinic period to today. This running narrative of the ever-adapting nature of Judaism and ritual we've seen over the past few sessions. We saw it with Dr. Levine, who spoke about Jesus and Judaism, and then again last week with Rabbi Waxman as we explored the pandemic and sort of disruptions to Judaism today. So this lecture today will continue this theme as it both enriches our understanding of the historical roots of the Haggadah, and also hopefully, I imagine, will help us enliven and evolve our Passover Seders today. So I'm very happy to have Dr. Brettler with us. And thank you all for joining us this morning or afternoon, as I said before. And I now welcome Sol Levy, the chair of the Life Lecture Committee at B'nai Israel, to offer a few words of welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Matt. Good morning, everyone. As Matt said, I'm Sol Levy, and I'm the chair of the B'nai Israel Life Lecture Committee, and it's my pleasure to welcome our B'nai Israel congregants and those from other synagogues who joined us today, as well as just members of the general community. For some years now, B'nai Israel and the Haberman Institute have co-sponsored a variety of special programs, and I'm sure that this one will be successful as well. Please note that our next Life Lecture will be in a few weeks on Tuesday, not Sunday, but Tuesday, April 27th at 7 p.m. with Mark Nobleman. The topic is somewhat different from today's topic, and his topic will be the Jews and the secrets behind Batman and Superman. So if that's intrigued you, please tune into that program on Tuesday, April 27th. It's designed to appeal to all of us, regardless of age, and should bring back memories of our youth. More details with registration information will be sent out in April, so be on the lookout for it. Now I'd like to welcome Avi West, a dear friend and master educator, who will introduce our featured speaker, Professor Marc Brettler. Avi, the screen is yours.
Thank you, Sol, for your warm welcome. Good morning, everybody. I'd like to personally welcome Dr. Brettler to the Haberman Institute community, which now extends well beyond the Washington, D.C. area. As a member of the Haberman Institute board, I would also like to thank all of our community partners for helping us bring this program to so many this morning. That's B'nai Israel Congregation, Kol Ami of Northern Virginia, and Adat Shalom Reconstructionist Congregation. Now on to this morning's event. Marc Zvi Brettler is the Bernice and Morton Lerner Professor of Jewish Studies in the Department of Religious Studies at Duke University, and Dora Golding Professor Emeritus of the Biblical Studies at Brandeis University. I think he's going to need a giant business card. A graduate of Brandeis University, he has published and lectured widely on metaphor in the Bible, the nature of biblical historical texts, and gender issues in the Bible. He's the co-editor of the Jewish Study Bible, something that's on my shelf all the time, and with Amy Jill Levine, who spoke to our community just a few weeks ago, and has both edited the Jewish Annotated New Testament and co-authored the Bible with and without Jesus, how Jews and Christians read the same stories differently. Dr. Brettler has written for The Forward and the Jerusalem Report. He has spent recent sabbaticals studying, teaching, and lecturing in Israel, China, and Japan. If you want to hear his voice over your shoulder, you should keep the Jewish Study Bible and all the Haggadah texts he's co-authored with you, especially in this season. He's a friend and teacher to many in our community, including Rabbi Berkowitz from B'nai Israel. And we are thrilled to have you with us from Israel today. Just a heads up, the feed from Israel could act up. Don't panic, we'll be right on it and we'll get everything back in order. Today's lecture will be followed by a question and answer period. Behind the scenes, the Haberman staff will be curating your questions. Please enter them in the Q&A button on your screen. We will not be able to address live or hand-raised questions in this format. But I know that they will be reading your thoughts and will convey ideas and questions diligently. Additionally, keep an eye on your email tomorrow for an audience survey. Your feedback is very important to us. And with that, the Zoom box is yours, Dr. Brettler. We're excited to learn with you.
Thank you very much for that wonderful introduction, and welcome to all of you from Israel. I love DC. I miss DC. I miss the general area of the district and beyond. And I'm very sorry that I can't say hello to many of you whom I'm sure I know in person. And I know many of you from 14 years ago, when at Rabbi Haberman's invitation, I spent a month at the Foundation for Jewish Studies as a Foundation for Jewish Studies scholar. I had a great time and met many wonderful people throughout the broader area. Rabbi Haberman was a wonderful man. Yehi zichro baruch. May his memory be for a blessing. It is a true honor to return in a series of lectures named in his honor. I'm a biblical scholar. So despite the title, my focus is going to be largely on ancient texts. But before you mute me, as a Jew, I believe that what is ancient is still relevant, and I hope that I'll be able to convince you of that. So among other takeaways that I hope you'll get from this lecture, I hope you'll get to see that the Haggadah has changed over time and why, and that you'll see the Haggadah as a broad outline rather than as a script or an exact libretto, and that will somehow enhance your Seder experience. I now want to move on to the text, which I know some of you have. And for those of you who do not have this, I'm told that you could look in the chat box, which I don't want to do while I'm lecturing, and you will see a link that will let you get this particular text at a later date. So let's begin with the basis for the Seder and the Haggadah. And let's not confuse the two of them, because you certainly... Okay, good. So to start back where we were. So the Haggadah and the Seder need to be disentangled. So let me start with the Haggadah in the name of the Haggadah, which literally means to tell or to explain. And the name is certainly not biblical. It's only attested in much later periods because neither the Seder nor the Haggadah is biblical, but it is based on a verse dealing with various things concerning the Exodus from Egypt, from Exodus chapter 13, verse 5, where you have a very, very open-ended command. I'll do just the two words in the Hebrew and then the rest in the English. V'higata levincha, and you shall explain to your son or to your child on that day. Well, what do you need to explain? How do you explain it? Is there a text for this? When exactly do you need to explain it? None of that is detailed, and it is only much later that there would be first an outline of what needs to be said, and then more or less a defined text of what the Haggadah should look like. Now, the Haggadah is very much a part of the Seder. And again, the Seder itself is certainly not biblical. And you heard Amy Jill Levine, my co-author and co-editor, a few weeks ago. We do a lot of work together. And we often get questions about the Seder in the New Testament and the Seder in early Christianity. And the simple answer is no. The Seder did not exist in the late Second Temple period, namely in the 1st century of the Common Era, which is the time of the life and death of Jesus. So in other words, if you look at various Jewish sources from this period, and if you want to talk about the period through that of the New Testament, we're talking about various books of the Apocrypha, various Second Temple books, which have a strange, fancy title, pseudepigrapha. Happy to talk about that later. We're talking about the work of the great Jewish historian Josephus. We're talking about who lived in the land of Israel and then later in Rome. We're talking about Philo of Alexandria, who is often considered to be the first Jewish philosopher. And also we're talking about the New Testament, which really is one of the most important sources for understanding first century Judaism, as I'm sure Professor Levine explained. None of these sources, and these sources are quite extensive, none, and that's the word I use really, really carefully, none of them has any indication that there is a formal Seder. And there's really a very simple reason for this. Until the destruction of the Second Temple, the main way in which Passover was commemorated was through the Paschal Lamb. That was Passover. Families, extended families, without masks before Corona would get together. They would slaughter a lamb. They would share it together. They would eat it with matzah. They would eat it with bitter herbs. We'll come to one of those verses later. And it would really be a tremendous festive event. Once the Second Temple was destroyed and sacrifices ceased, the urge to commemorate the events of the Exodus and other events surrounding the Passover needed to go somewhere. And eventually, these crystallized in the Seder. And again, this happened in the early rabbinic period. We know this from the earliest rabbinic texts, from the Mishnah and other related texts, and the Seder would continue to develop over time. So that is a basic intro. Given that my main specialization is the Hebrew Bible, the Tanakh, what I really like to focus on, which I believe, to use a double negative, which of course I shouldn't do, is not irrelevant, is that looking at the Seder and looking at the Haggadah from a biblical perspective is valuable. And I have 4 claims that I'd like to back up with a variety of texts. And here they are, and then I'll go through them one at a time. The first one is that one of the problems that the rabbis had, and of course, problems become opportunities, and we'll see this in all 4 of these points, is that the Bible, in describing various events concerning the Exodus, has a whole bunch of traditions. And the rabbis, point number 1, sometimes chose one over the other, elevated one over the other, and allowed others to be forgotten or to be less important. Secondly, when we look at the Haggadah, certain strange things are happening, certain repetitions, certain things which are stated time after time again, which seem to be polemical. And I would say if something seems to be polemical, it often is. And point number 2 is that sometimes in the Haggadah, there's certain issues that are found in the Bible which are polemicized against, as if the rabbis are trying to make them be forgotten. Third point, and we'll see this especially concerning the wise son, where the text, when the Haggadah began to develop, the text of the Bible was not fully crystallized and was not identical to the text which we know today from all Jewish Bibles or from a Sefer Torah. And I'm going to give you one example where there's a real conundrum in the Haggadah, which is best explained by the fact that when this particular part of the Haggadah developed, the biblical text was different. And finally, the core part of the Haggadah is a midrash, is a rabbinic exposition on Deuteronomy 26, which is a short confession that an ancient Israelite recited when bringing the first fruits to the temple. I'm going to talk a little bit about how that quoted section of Exodus 26 helps to shape the Haggadah. So I'll deal with each of these points separately, but I hope you'll see how they come together to focus on how the Bible shaped the Haggadah in a variety of ways. So my first claim, that sometimes in putting the Haggadah together, and again, there's no single individual who put the Haggadah together. This happened over time, but in the Haggadah itself, there often is a choice between different biblical traditions, with one elevated over the other. So if I ask a very simple question, and I like simple questions, but if I ask a very simple question, why do I eat matzah? And if we were in a normal room, you would raise your hand, and I would hope that between all of you, I would get 3 different answers. The one which I probably would not get, or would not easily get, or would have to tease out of you, is this first one, which is that when the Israelites were commanded to prepare for the Passover sacrifice before the Exodus, and this is kind of this sentence before the Exodus, that phrase is quite important. They are told that they need to eat the Passover meat roasted over fire with matzah and bitter herbs. Now, again, I remind you, this is before the Exodus, so it can't have anything to do with what is going to happen later in the chapter. So in other words, everybody enjoys the sandwich that is made later in the Haggadah. This is a type of sandwich that they need to eat. You have a type of bread, and you have a type of condiment, bitter herbs with it, and you put your meat on it, and that's wonderful. Though I imagine this is an open-faced sandwich rather than a closed one. Now let's go to the second reason, which many of you would have said. We eat matzah to commemorate what happened during the Exodus from Egypt, where there was simply no time for the unleavened cakes of dough to rise, and therefore they ate flatbread. Okay, reason number 2. Reason number 3, okay, so if this reason is in Exodus, this reason number 3 is in Deuteronomy, where the Passover celebration is legislated, and you are told that for 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread, and that unleavened bread is defined as lechem oni, bread of distress, where the assumption seems to be that if you're poor, you eat crackers, if you're rich, you eat bread. That somehow, if you're poor, you do not have the wherewithal of the time or the shekels to be able to buy bread, which is fully risen. Now let's go back to my main point, that the text of the Haggadah, unlike what I would have done, I always like to say, if I wrote the Bible or if I wrote the Haggadah, if I wrote the Haggadah, I would have combined all 3 of these reasons together every time we talked about matzah. But no, that is not the case. Before you're too drunk, you also remember the beginning of the Haggadah. This is the bread of poverty. Okay, that is reason number 3 that you have at the beginning of the Haggadah. Or one section which does have a rabbinic basis, which says that there are 3 things that you need to focus on during the Seder: Pesach, Matzah, and Maror, the Paschal Lamb, Matzah, and the bitter herbs. And it says, why do we eat the matzah? And the reason that is given for why you eat the matzah, this follows immediately, is reason number 2, having to do with the fact that you were chased from Egypt, or you fled from Egypt so quickly, the bread never had a chance to rise. So my simple point is, the Haggadah chooses in different places one reason over another, elevates one biblical text over another, and does not combine these various traditions. The next case that I'm going to might be offer a better example of that, and for many of you, a much more surprising example. And suddenly you're going to think that I'm an idiot because I'm asking how many plagues were there in Egypt. And everybody knows that there were 10 plagues in Egypt. Although I must say, one of my favorite Jewish education life experiences was when my kids were really young, I once looked into their nursery school, and the bulletin board, I think, had the 6 plagues on it. I went to the nursery school teacher, like, what's going on? Don't you know that there are 10 plagues? And the nursery school teacher said quite cleverly, oh, some of them are just too upsetting for the children. So we had to cut them out. But in any case, the Bible itself, even though it never gives a number for the plagues, if you count them, and I'm happy to discuss later in the questions and answers why I think no number is ever given in the Bible itself, there indeed are 10 plagues. Most of what they mean is relatively clear, and you'll understand why I need to talk about this in a moment. The only plague that does not translate clearly into English is the plague that in Hebrew is arov, which means swarms. And there are 2 different traditions concerning this in the Jewish interpretive tradition. One is that it is swarms of insects. Another is that it is swarms of wild animals. So again, the word itself, arov, does actually not mean wild animals, but just refers to something that is a multitude. Well, indeed, it is the case that in the book of Exodus, there are 10 plagues, but look in here, I've highlighted this in red. If you don't believe me, you could go back and look at the handout or study these 2 Psalms, and you will see that I did not pervert the biblical text or change things around. The biblical plagues are recounted twice in the book of Psalms. In Psalm 78 and Psalm 105, I just decided to flip things around. I started with Psalm 105. So you could see this is talking about the plagues. He performed his signs among them and so forth. Now, what was the first plague? Darkness. Darkness, you say? Yes, darkness, according to Psalm 105. Now I'm going to use my fingers to count. I know this is a little primitive, but that's the best I could do. Darkness, followed by blood, followed by frogs, followed by, because each verse seems to have a single plague, followed by swarms of lice, followed by hail, followed by locusts, followed by death of the firstborn. Okay, if you want to, you can decide, you can see which plagues are missing. Boils, for example, are missing. Pestilence, I just love the English word pestilence, is missing, but 7 plagues here. Or if you want to insist that swarms is its own plague, 8. Now, in case that does not pique your interest, please note, as I said a moment ago, these plagues appear twice in the book of Psalms, and you would at least think that the book of Psalms should be consistent, but it doesn't work that way. Okay, here you might be relieved that Psalm 78 has blood as its first plague rather than darkness. Okay, then the next plague, I again think this is swarms of frogs that you have here. Locusts, I think that there are a total of 7 plagues. So there's hail against the agricultural products, then hail against the animals, then pestilence, and then death of the firstborn. So here you see that even though in Exodus you have 10 plagues, in these 2 places in Psalms, you have different lists, most likely of 7 plagues. 7 is a really good number. It's as good as 10 or better than 10 in terms of the ancient Near Eastern world and the biblical world. So now you should suddenly understand why several texts in the Haggadah emphasize that there are 10 plagues. Let me go back to the main point I'm trying to make. that sometimes the Haggadah is aware of the fact that there are multiple traditions, and it emphasizes one of them at the expense of the other. So that is why it says, these are the 10 plagues that the Holy One, blessed be he, brought against the Egyptians in Egypt. And that is why you have the famous mnemonic after the 10 plagues are given, because if you count up the letter in the 10 plague in here, you will indeed get 10 plagues, and you will have them in the right order, with Daled for dam, blood at the beginning, and so forth. In other words, and this is an important part of what the rabbis do. I needed to show I was a professor at one point in this, so I threw in some Latin. You'll excuse me for this. They needed to show that the Torah, even though the entire Hebrew Bible, the entire Tanakh, is important and central and canonical for the Jewish community, the Torah is primus inter pares, is first among equals. And how do you do it? By really not giving any voice or much voice to the tradition that you have in the book of Psalms concerning 7 Psalms in a different order, but making sure that the Torah tradition wins. And this is something that very often happens in rabbinic literature. And again, the Torah, the Haggadah is, or large parts of the Haggadah are from parts of rabbinic literature. Okay, claim number 2, that sometimes there are old minority traditions that are obliquely recognized by the Haggadah, but they're quashed. They are polemicized against. So I might have some bad news for some of you. It's not so clear when Passover begins, and don't panic, but according to one biblical tradition, interpreted in a particular way that I think is correct, today is the day of Passover, because today is Rosh Chodesh Nisan. Today is the first day of Nisan. So this all has to do with the translation of a particular word that appears in a variety of places, namely the word Chodesh. Now again, why are we not celebrating or starting Passover today? Because we follow the festival calendar that appears in Leviticus 23, which makes it very clear that Passover begins in the 4th day of the month. Which month? The first month, the one we call at Nisan. That is when you have a Passover offering. That could also be translated as Passover time to the Lord, time to begin eating matzah. But life is not so simple, because this text in the Bible makes it clear that Passover begins on the 14th day of the first month. But let's take a look at a couple of biblical texts, and I'm purposely not giving you a translation because I'm going to give you 2 translations. But what I want you to see is that this text in Exodus 13, then 23, then 34, and then Deuteronomy 16, all have this word, which means Chodesh, which is Chodesh, which means, oh, here's where the problem is going to start. Both new moon and month. So simple observation. Biblical Hebrew vocabulary is much more impoverished than English vocabulary, and that therefore means that a single biblical Hebrew word is often going to have many more meanings than a single English word. So in these 4 verses, which I outlined above, again, here you have them in English, Let's take the Jewish Publication Society translation. You go free on this day in the month of Aviv. Observe the Feast of Unleavened Bread in the set time in the month of Aviv. In the set time of the month of Aviv. Aviv simply means budding. It's when the new corn starts. Observe the month of Aviv in Deuteronomy 16:1. Now I'm going to point out something strange here by using an analogy. You probably would not say, and it's great because you're all on mute, you can't doubt me. You probably would not say, observe the month of July and in it have a commemoration of your liberation from the British, right? You would probably say something like, observe the 4th of July, and so forth. Similarly, like why would you say in Exodus 13:4, oh, let me give you a general month in which you left the land of Egypt? This seems to be a much more specific designation of a particular day. And thus, to choose another translation, which in this particular case, I am going to prefer the translation of Everett Fox. I was going to, if you look for this, this is sometimes called the Shotgun Bible because Shotgun Press is the publisher of it. I just couldn't put in the title because it's really called on the first page, The 5 Books of Moses by Everett Fox. And I thought that that's going a little too far in terms of the title of the book. But if you look up Everett Fox, you will find it. Note what he does. Today you are going out in the new moon of ripe grain. Commemorate this at the appointed time in the new moon. Keep the new moon of Aviv ripe grain, which again, I remind you is today. So again, I think that there really are 2 traditions in the Bible, and this happens. The Bible, even the Torah, from my perspective, is a composite work. There may have been different groups, maybe different geographical areas, which commemorated this festival differently. There are 2 main times of commemorating festivals, either at the beginning of the month or in the middle of the month. And I think that according to these texts, Passover was commemorated at the beginning of the month of Aviv, what we now call the month of Nisan, the month that is beginning now. Now you might understand something that you have in the Haggadah. There's a text that you have toward the beginning that says, one might have thought that you're supposed to do all of this stuff from the first of the month. Why would you have possibly thought that you're going to have to do all of this commemorative stuff from the first of the month? Oh, there's a very good reason. Because you have 3 biblical texts that say that, 4 biblical texts that say that Passover should be commemorated at Chodesh HaAviv, and Chodesh in such contexts typically means new month. Thus, this Haggadah text that comes to tell you, if for days like today, if it's the beginning of Nisan and you haven't started your Passover cleaning, don't get too nervous yet. You still have another 2 weeks. The other texts come to correct you, to tell you that Passover really starts on the 14th and not on the new month. Okay. Second illustration. Again, you're going to think I'm a little crazy that I forgot in my Bible for asking, that I'm even asking this because you think the answer is so obvious. But I'm going to show you that the answer is not so obvious. And you think that the answer is obvious because you are reading the Haggadah, you're reading the Bible through the lens of the Haggadah, and therefore not seeing the Haggadah in all of its multiplicity. So you remember there's a strange blood ritual during the death of the firstborn so that the Israelites are going to be saved. So let me show you 2 texts that talk about this. And the blood on the houses where you are staying shall be a sign for you. when I, this is a first person, and the I is clearly God, when I see the blood, I will, and this word can either be translated as pass over or protect. I'm happy to talk about that later, you, so that no plague will destroy you when I strike the land of Egypt. You know, I'm imagining this image. It's as if you put the blood there, and it's as if the blood functions as a giant face mask. And it is not going to allow the blood, it is not going to allow the plague, which is rampant in the land of Egypt, to enter into the Israelite household. And the thing that is quite clear about this is God is the subject of who is doing the destruction in verse 13. But take a look in verse 23. For when the Lord goes through to smite the Egyptians, he will see the blood on the lintel and the two doorposts. And the Lord, I think this should really be, will protect the door and not let the destroyer enter and smite your home. Destroyer, hamashchit. This is a very different image in verse 23 than what you have in verse 13. The image that you have in verse 23 is an image that you might very well know from one of the last songs in the Haggadah, from Chad Gadya, where the next to last part is Malach HaMavet, the angel of death. And this mashchit, this destroyer, is the one who is going to actually do the destruction, is going to kill the firstborn. And indeed, here you see in a biblical lexicon, you have the word mashchit, and there are cases in the Bible where it really does refer to a demon. Now, let me go back to what I was trying to say. Sometimes there are cases in the Haggadah where the Haggadah is trying to insist that a minority opinion that you have in the Bible itself is wrong. And this is a very clear case of this. And Adonai brought us out of Egypt, not by an angel, not by a seraph, not by a messenger, but blessed, holy be he himself in his glory, as scripture says. I will pass through the land of Egypt tonight. I will smite every firstborn of Egypt, from man to beast. I will execute judgment against all the gods. I am Adonai. Some Haggadot even add, Ani Adonai velo acher. I am the Lord and no other. Like God. No, excuse me. I mean, why is it saying, not by, that was a slip, not by, it wasn't in the script, not by an angel, not by a seraph, not by a messenger? Because whoever wrote this is very well aware of the fact that you do have in one place an image in the book of Exodus where God is not doing everything directly. God has delegated responsibility. God has an angel of death who is killing all of the firstborn. And therefore, this section insisting that it is God himself who is doing the destruction. The third thing that I'd like to illustrate. This brings me back to a particular problem and to my late father, who taught me an expression, which some of you may know, which is called a chacham from the manishtana, a wise son from why, from the manishtana, from why is this one different than all the others. And here's the problem that you have in the text of the Haggadah that we now have concerning the four wise children. Actually, I think the best way to do this is I'm going to start with the wicked son. So what does the wicked son say? What is the service to you? He refers to you rather than to himself, And you all know how this continues, and therefore you have to bash him in his teeth. Why? Because he uses this pronoun lachem, you, rather than us, and therefore he is removing himself from the community by using that particular pronoun. Now here's a small problem. What does the wise son say? Ma ha'edot v'hachukim v'mishpatim asher tziva Adonai Eloheinu etchem. What are all of these laws and testimonies and so forth that God commanded you? I mean, you and you, right? There is no difference. It's a slightly different pronoun that's used, but you have the same chem here, you have the same chem here, the same masculine plural term. But the wise son, you answer in a very proper way. You teach him the laws of Passover and so forth. So my simple question is, the wise son and the wicked son commit the same pronoun, I don't know what to call it, pronoun violation by using this you rather than us. So why are they treated differently? And here it has been pointed out, and let me just make it clear, the text of the wise son is based on Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 20. Again, what are all these decrees, laws, and rules that the Lord has enjoined upon you? Etchem. But even as late as the early rabbinic period, the text of the Bible had not solidified. And to move a little before the biblical period, the Septuagint, the ancient Greek translation of the Torah, begun in the 3rd pre-Christian century and is called the Septuagint because according to legends recorded in a variety of places, either 70 or 72 elders were involved in this particular translation. When it translates this verse into Greek, instead of having the word you here in Greek, it has the word us. Now, we now know, and I'm happy to discuss this later, from the Dead Sea Scrolls and other places, that this Septuagint translation was not a free translation. And in many, if not most places, where the Greek differs from the Hebrew, it does not differ from the Hebrew because they felt like it, but it differs from the Hebrew because they were translating a different text. And it is very likely that the text that they were translating of Deuteronomy 6:20 had the word us instead of you. Now let me go back, and you're going to see this makes perfect sense. Why do you condemn the wicked? Because he said, what is the service to you? What did this text from the Haggadah originally read for the righteous son? It was a Hebrew text following what is now best attested in the Septuagint. What are all these testimonies that God commanded us? Not you, okay? And because that was the original text, he includes himself in the community. Therefore, he's a good guy. Go teach him. And by the way, there are texts of the Haggadah, including good manuscripts of Maimonides' texts of the Haggadah. So that's early 2nd millennium, which actually have the word otanu, us, rather than etchem over here. So I know that there are many, many, many homiletic interpretations on why you treat the wicked son differently than you treat the righteous son. And those are wonderful homiletic interpretations. I have nothing against homiletic interpretations, but it is likely that the origin of this particular difference is that the text here said us rather than you. And indeed, in some of your Haggadot, in your English translations, you will see us rather than you in order to make this point clear. Final point I would like to make before getting to takeaways, and then be delighted to take your questions. So the central section of the Haggadah, what is called the Magid, what you recite, again, Magid Haggadah, the same root, is this short text from Exodus chapter 26, which is expounded in the Haggadah, where you have a quote, sometimes even of a single word, like the word mighty from Deuteronomy chapter 26. That single quote, a single word, excuse me, is followed by Kema shene'emar, as scripture relates, and then is connected to the story of the Exodus as it is told elsewhere, often by showing that the same root is used elsewhere. In other words, Deuteronomy 26 is a very short text. And what this section of the Haggadah does is it connects different words of Deuteronomy 26, especially to sections of Exodus, to show that Exodus and Deuteronomy fully agree with each other. Now, let me make a very small point, which this particular text cannot really deal with. Exodus and Deuteronomy do not agree with each other. Deuteronomy 26, for example, never talks about the 10 plagues or the 7 plagues. But from the rabbinic perspective, the Bible is a unity. And the Midrash, the exposition on Deuteronomy 26, shows or aims to show the unity of the Bible. So let me just comment on what I see as a particular irony here. You read any rabbinic text. So here's the irony. Isn't it great? I say there's an irony, then you lose me. So I hope you weren't killed by the tension. The irony is that the rabbis are full of saying, oh, here's interpretation 1, interpretation number 2, interpretation number 3, davar acher, davarach, each of them separated by davar acher, a different interpretation. And as a biblical scholar, I know that that's the structure of the Bible. Yet even though the rabbis themselves are so multi-perspectival or pluralistic, they refuse to recognize how multi-perspectival or pluralistic the biblical text itself is. So here's what I hope you have learned from this. Some people are just historically minded. So I hope you've seen changes over time, and enjoyed seeing that. Changes in the Bible over time, how the Haggadah, to some extent, I can only show you some glimpses of that, changed over time. But furthermore, if you think that historical changes can offer a precedent, then I hope that some of what I've shown you, to go back to my introduction, can suggest that the Haggadah does not need to be used as a script or as a libretto, and that you really can continue to change things over time using your own creativity. Again, you want to read more about some of this in something I co-founded called thetorah.com. I have an article which goes over some of these points. And in the introduction, kind enough to mention my contribution to my Passover's Haggadah. And a final call out to a former student of mine, Eve Levavi Feinstein, and her husband, who in this amazing website called the Open Siddur have a very good text, Hebrew-English text of the Haggadah. And this is an amazing website which has all sorts of Jewish liturgical information. If you're not aware of it, I really urge you to peruse it. So with that, my formal comments have come to an end. But before I forget, it's good to know Passover is not today. So you have another 2 weeks. Happy Passover, Chag Sameach, and I'm very happy to take your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Brettler, for a very, very interesting lecture. And I'll jump right into the questions here. Going back, there's some questions you say of evolving over time and how it changes over time. And so there's some questions about how what happened pre the Second Temple period. What was the practice of the Passover or Pesach offering during prior to the rabbinic period?
Yeah, so great question. Prior to the rabbinic period, and you could see this in Exodus 12. So last Shabbat was Parashat HaChodesh, was a special reading for the new moon of Nisan from the beginning, first part of Exodus chapter 12. And you could go take a look there. You get a Passover lamb the night before. And this is actually called in the New Testament, the night of preparation. And you slaughter it, you cook it, and you eat it together as a big family. You have to remember that this is a pre-refrigeration era. Lambs have a relatively large amount of meat. So this would be done with extended family. This would be done, the rabbis discuss this. You could invite other groups to join you, but you would all join together in having a lamb. Now, there are certain special rituals around this lamb. So unlike some other sacrifices could be eaten with matzot, but no other sacrifice was eaten with mirorim, was eaten with bitter herbs. According to the legislation of that particular sacrifice in Exodus chapter 12, you didn't break the bones. Ve'etzem lo tishberu bo. And of course, the tastiest part of lamb is the marrow of the bones. So one has to imagine that as this meal was eaten together, a festive meal, and again, meat was only eaten in festive times, different people around, especially children, would have said, what's going on? Somebody would have said, pass me that bone, I'd love to suck on it. And the father or mother would have said, no, sorry, this is the night on which we do not break bones. A kid would have said, why do I need to eat this delicious lamb with bitter herbs? I mean, it's ruining the taste. And by the way, let me just say, one of the things that I was a graduate student here in Jerusalem from 1978 to 1980, and the Samaritan Jews still observe the Passover sacrifice. And in 1979, I attended a Samaritan Passover sacrifice, which is a quite interesting experience. You could look it up. There are certainly videos of it. It's no longer safe to go do it these days, but then it was relatively safe. And so, you could really see them. You see them slaughter the lambs. They would prepare a day before. They would dig giant pits. How do you cook a whole lamb? It was called tol. Put them on spits. The pit was lined with stones for about half a day beforehand. They had wood in those pits, which became very, very hot. As a result, the stones became very, very hot. And that's how you cook a whole lamb. You put it inside this pit, which is lined with white hot stones. You cover it on top, wait a few hours. And I did not taste their lamb because we left before it was fully cooked. I had no real interest in raw Samaritan lamb, but I did taste their maror. Maror that we eat, horseradish is really an Eastern European notion. They eat stuff which is much more mild than the horseradish that we're eating. It doesn't clear your sinuses. It doesn't make you tear up. But to answer your question, it was a big festive meal around lamb, which was not eaten very often. And I think this has something to do with the origins of the Haggadah. There were enough special things going on at that meal that kids would inevitably ask questions about it. It's like, hey, Dad, where's the bread? Hey, Mom, what's the strange herb stuff that we're eating? And I think that in that sense, the origin of the Seder is in the Second Temple period. But to the extent that Seder means order, there was really no order to it. It was really very flexible, and the questions and answers would be much more organic than they are compared to the way in which the Seder now appears. And I guess part of what I'm saying is I'm not advocating, digging a pit and doing lamb in your backyard, but there's some of this organic questioning, I think, was a part of what happened in the First and Second Temple period. And I think it's very constructive. We should go back to that.
Thank you. And so I guess as a follow-up, moving from that period into the rabbinic period, what was the process for how the Haggadah was sort of codified or composed through the rabbinic period?
Okay. There's an awful lot we don't know. So the evidence we do have, let me just say that one of the best places for this, and I had a reference to this, I think, on the first page of the handout, is Baruch Boxer's book, The Origin of the Seder. And so you have one of the chapters in the Mishnah in Tractate Pesach, Passover, that deals with the basic structure of the Haggadah. And you have a parallel to that in the Tosefta, another rabbinic text from more or less the same time period. But it's really an outline, which was more or less fill it in the way in which you would like to. And then we have some evidence from the early post-Talmudic period. But the next time that we really have evidence from, and this is something that I love, and there's an appendix in my People's Passover Haggadah that has this. We have evidence from the Cairo Geniza. So Geniza is a place where used Jewish books were put. There was a famous Geniza in Cairo, actually right outside of Cairo, in Old Cairo, called Fustat. And we have found a Passover Haggadah there. And it is much shorter than the Haggadah that we now have. And the Haggadah never quite became codified. Different groups added different things. Certainly what for many of us, is, at least for me, the part of the Haggadah that I like very much, the songs at the end, they're all medieval songs. They're often medieval songs added sort of an analogy to Christian or vernacular songs that were used. So the Haggadah, more than any other Jewish text that I could think of, has developed and continued to develop over time, and there could be significant local differerences. And not only significant local differences in text, but also in particular customs. So custom, you can look at my skin, I'm clearly not a Yemenite Jew, but a Yemenite custom, which I love, is toward the beginning of the Seder, they will put some matzah or something else in a satchel, put it over their shoulder, start walking around and say in Aramaic, in a rushed way, our ancestors left the land of Egypt. So there were even ways of acting out the Seder in different Jewish communities. So unlike the Torah, and this is actually a lecture I gave in Washington 14 years ago. I said, one of the great Jewish miracles is that no matter where you go, the Torah text is going to be the same on Shabbat. And it really is a miracle. And so everybody has forgotten what I said 14 years ago. You could invite me to do that lecture again, that everybody has the same biblical text, okay? No one has the same Haggadah text. So certain parts are key and have stayed. And let me just give you another example. The Manish Tana and how certain things changed. the original Manish Tana, the original 4 questions, one of the 4 questions was about meat that you ate only roasted meat on Passover. Well, that was because of the Passover sacrifice. That custom changed, and therefore the 4 questions themselves changed. So it's an incredibly fluid text.
Thank you. I'm going to combine a couple of questions here, and you can feel free to answer it however it works best. But there's a sort of a rabbinic thought question about how the Bible is used, like why the rabbis stress the primacy of the Torah. And then also on the opposite end, there's questions about the Seder modeling Roman, the Roman symposia. So I don't know if thoughts on those two.
Yeah, okay, those are 2 separate questions, but look, I think that if you talk about canonization of the Bible, and again, this would get me into that lecture from 14 years ago, and I can't quite reduce it into a 2-minute soundbite. But one of the things that I think is clear is that the Torah was the first part of the Bible that was canonized. And again, just to remind everybody, we read the entirety of the Torah, whether it's read in a 1-year period or read in a 3-year period, so that even within rabbinic literature, the Torah has a special status. And you also see this to the extent that rabbinic ideology is very concerned with halakha, with Jewish law. You could learn Jewish law from the Torah, but you do not learn Jewish law from the other 2 parts of the Jewish canon. So just historically, the Torah has always been more central than other parts. There's good evidence that this goes back at least to the Second Temple period, where actually part of the origin of the synagogue was in the public reading of the Torah. The synagogue was not originally a place for prayer. It originally was a place for Torah reading. And as such, it always remained first among equals. And of course, when you say first among equals, you're really saying that it is first among unequals. The Torah has this central place, and all sorts of rabbinic texts emphasize this in one way or another. And it should not be much of a surprise that the Passover Haggadah text emphasizes this as well. Yeah, and the point about the Roman symposia, I mean, that is perfect in terms of what I started with and other questions that were asked about the origin of the Seder. I mean, this is something which originated in the Roman period. The seating, for example, and the leaning was very typical of the Roman symposium. And again, the book by Boxer brings lots of parallels between the Roman symposia and the Seder. So in a sense, the Seder, or many elements of the Seder, really are a Judaized Roman symposium, where the text is going to be a Jewish text, and the theme is going to be the Exodus from Egypt and the various rituals around the Exodus of Egypt. And it should be no surprise. I mean, this is one of the wonderful things about Judaism. I mean, some people think it's terrible that we accommodate the cultures that are around us. But as an evolving religion, we're always influenced by the cultures that are around us, sometimes absorbing certain elements from them, and sometimes protesting and not absorbing those various elements.
Yeah, so thank you. So on that note, there's a few questions about polemics and within the Haggadah, or it may be like issues with different peoples of the time. And so there's a question about the Karaites, if there's commentary on how the Karaite Haggadah differs, and then also maybe with the followers of Jesus or developing Christianity, some polemics within the texts.
Yeah, it's a good question. I was never asked about Karaite Haggadah before. I don't know that the Karaites have a Haggadah. but I would need to look that up, and I can't multitask, so I'm not gonna answer about that. Christian polemic against in the Haggadah. I mean, there's always a question. Well, let me just put it this way. At what point people are starting to wonder, did Judaism start to strongly polemicize against Christianity? Now, that's only going to be once Christianity really became a very strong religion, in the 4th century and later. And it is only going to happen in places where Christianity was very strong. So to the extent that at least the Haggadah itself crystallized, or the outline of the Haggadah began to crystallize in the Mishnah, which is late 2nd century in the land of Israel, Christianity wasn't strong there yet. So in that outline, there is not anything that is at least that I know of, that I see, is very strongly anti-Christian. And then given that the bulk of the development of the Haggadah is what you have in Babylon, okay, there Christianity certainly existed, but it wasn't the official religion, and Christianity was certainly not as important as other religions as Zoroastrianism. And I'll just say in general, a change that I've seen in scholarship in the last 20, 30 years is there's much less of an emphasis on polemic within Judaism, although certainly it exists at certain times in certain places. And I think the Haggadah is much more of an internal development. And I'm not seeing, there would be lots of opportunities for the Haggadah to polemicize against Christianity. So I don't know if the questioner was thinking of anything in particular, but as my mind goes.
It looks, sorry, everyone. It looks like we lost Dr. Brettler again momentarily. Thankfully, at this point, we're through the majority of the program, and I have a couple more questions. Oh, he's back.
I'm back.
You're back.
Okay, let's just take another 1 or 2 or 3 questions.
Yeah. Okay. I'll there's a couple more here, and then I'll let you conclude. But as a follow-up to the question about Christianity and the followers of Jesus, you mentioned the Last Supper, and so there's three or more people have asked about the Last Supper in the
So the Last Supper is a Passover sacrifice. I mean, actually, let's be clear. In terms of the Gospels, there are 3 Gospels which are very closely related to each other, called the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And there, the Last Supper is the Passover sacrifice. That's all. And because the Seder had not yet developed, Jesus and others are eating the Paschal Lamb together in Jerusalem, as was customary. They're not doing anything else. They're eating it as biblically mandated. So they're eating it with matzah. They're eating it with bitter herbs. But they're certainly not singing the Manishtana or doing any of those other things, or having the 10-part Seder that we are used to. So that's the Last Supper in Jesus. I'm sorry. Was there another question tied to that?
That was all about that one. There was one. I'll ask one.
So let me just say. So therefore, when I'm sorry, I meant to say it in John. The meal is happening before Passover. It is not even a Passover meal in the Gospel of John, which told a quite different story than the other 3 synoptic Passovers. So therefore, the Christian interest in attending a Jewish Seder as the Last Supper is historically misplaced.
Thank you. I think that clarifies it for everyone. So I appreciate that. And just as one final question, you had mentioned the word Pesach or Pasachti,
Yeah.
I think it was in the text, the protection versus Passover. And I was wondering if you want to say a little more about that before we conclude.
Yep, my pleasure. I'll also say, I'm pretty sure if you Google the Torah.com, the Torah one word.com, and you look up Passover, we have a whole column on how to translate the word Passover. So the root Pasach in biblical Hebrew is a homonym. There are some texts where it means to pass over. And there are some texts, especially in the book of Isaiah, chapter 30 something, I don't have all this stuff memorized, where it means to protect. And if you go back to the text in the book of Exodus, where it talks about where this root is using, and you start thinking about it, Pesach elsewhere doesn't really mean protect. It means to hop over. And when you read the texts in Exodus, and I'll just go back to them and read them, V'ra'iti et hadam, I, God, will see the blood, upasachti alechem, and I will, for now, translate Pesach over you, v'lo yiyeh v'chem negef, and there will be no plague against you. Well, I think it makes as much sense or more sense to translate, given that the word is a homonym, to translate the ufasachti alechem as I will protect you, rather than I will skip over you, especially given the tradition that I showed you before, that it is not actually God who's doing the destruction, but it is actually the mashchit, it is the destroyer, who later becomes the angel of death. So therefore, given that it's a homonym, and it could mean either, you really get, and given that it never really means to pass over, but it really means to skip. I mean, like it's really a strange image. So God is walking along, and like God is a little kid who is then just like, okay, Israelite house, I'm going to go skip my merry way. I think that the meaning of protect, which is a perfectly well-attested biblical Hebrew meaning, fits that particular text there much better. And I would say the majority of biblical scholars agree with that.
Thank you. Do you have any final thoughts that you would like to leave us with? I know you had some at the end of your lecture, but if you have any others, and then we can.
No, it's been a pleasure. I wish everyone a good Passover. And again, the Torah oneword.com has all sorts of pieces that are reliable on Passover, which fit with different parts of what I said. And if people are looking for more resources, that is a wonderful place to which I would urge you to turn. And I thank you all. I'm really sorry that I can't see all of you, even know all of your names. Those of you who I knew from 14 years ago, I miss seeing you. And I hope that things get better. I know I've talked a little bit too much about plagues, and I feel a little bit badly about that. But I hope that this plague indeed will soon get much better in the States as it is getting better in Israel. And I wish you all the best. And may this, for those of us for whom this is going to be a Zoom Seder, may this be our last Zoom Seder ever.
Amen to that. Yes, definitely. And thank you again for a very thought-provoking lecture and conversation. I'm sure all of our participants have new ways of looking at the Haggadah, and maybe we'll think through some new lenses this year. So thank you for that. And to all of you out there, have a happy Passover, a meaningful Passover. And thank you again for joining us this morning or afternoon, depending on where you are in the world, and have a great rest of your day.
Chag Sameach.
Chag Sameach.